This is TWiT.
I want to talk actually about the story you put in Slate this week, Cory, if you don't mind, because it kind of rang a bell with me. It kind of hit home. The dangers of cynical sci-fi disaster stories. It seems like that's all we're seeing these days. And certainly if you're watching a sci-fi on TV, on Amazon Prime or Netflix or HBO Max, it's dystopia as far as the eye can see. You've written your share of cynical sci-fi disaster stories. Why are you going to stop?
Well, I would say that I have written my share of cynical sci-fi disasters. If not the whole story was cynical, I tend to be a pretty idealistic and optimistic, or at least hopeful person. I, like everybody, really enjoy a zombie apocalypse story. There is something really exciting.
We're living in it.
Yeah, sure, yes. And you know, I'm a pulp writer. I write science fiction. I'm a pulp reader. I read science fiction. That means I like a lot of plot in my fiction. And usually, you know, the two plots are person versus nature. Conflict. And person versus person. Yeah. And if you're trying to like really lean into the plot, you could do person versus nature versus person. And that's the story where like the tsunami knocks your house down, your neighbors come over to eat you. Yeah. And there you go. Those stories I've really enjoyed. There's so many of those that I've read that I've enjoyed. And there's a little brother actually opens with a scene like that where they're in after a terrorist attack, they're down in a BART station and someone just randomly stabs someone else just because they can. Oh God. And I think the problem with that is twofold. One is like a verisimilitude problem. Or actually, let's call it threefold. One's a verisimilitude problem because generally we're pretty good to each other. You know, Rebecca Solnit's history of disasters, Paradise Built in Hell, very closely researched history of just people being really kind to each other and really stepping up during disasters, and of the countervailing force, which is not humanity's cruelty, but rather what she calls elite panic, the conviction on the part of wealthy people that when the lights go out, the poors are coming for them. And so this preemptive strike, you know, you may remember like Blackwater mercenaries shooting people in New Orleans after the hurricane. That sort of preemptive reaction, you know, getting your revenge in first, is really what turns crises into catastrophes. And so it's wrong. It's also the wrong intuition pump that, you know, when crisis strikes and we have to make a very quick decision about what's going to go on, we lean on the things that are most easy to imagine. And if every time you have seen a story about a disaster, you've been primed to believe that this is the time when your neighbor is coming over with a shotgun, you would be an idiot to like take the thawing food in your freezer, make a stew, and go over to your neighbor's house with a covered dish. But if you think that they're coming over with a covered dish, then everybody's good, right? Everybody shares. And that's how you get started. Because, of course, the answer to a disaster is not total war of all against all, right? The answer to a disaster is like getting the sanitation running again and figuring out how to distribute masks.
It kind of feels like we're in that crux right now where we could go either way.
It sure feels like it. It really does. And then that's the last part, is that it's bad art, because you know, there are lots of ways that people of goodwill can disagree with each other in ways that are irreconcilable, and that can make for stories that are really tense and really good, really plot driven, but that are truer to our human nature, which is that, you know, for the most part, people are good and want to help, but they may have a genuinely irreconcilable difference about what that help amounts to. So, you know, Attack Surface is a book about this young woman, Masha, who lives through the terrorist attack that is the inciting incident in Little Brother, and rather than becoming an opponent of the DHS, becomes a helper of the DHS to try and catch the terrorists. She then ends up in the second book working in a forward operations base in Iraq as like a Beltway bandit hunting jihadis. And when we meet her in the third book, she's just gone full-on cyber mercenary, and she's working for a company much like Palantir or the NSO Group, helping post-Soviet dictators crush pro-democracy movements. And she has to tell herself a story about why this is all okay. And that story is slowly collapsing, and she has to do more and more extreme things. And eventually the story collapses. She ends up back in San Francisco, no longer employed doing this. And she discovers to her horror that her childhood best friend, who's now an activist in a successor movement to the Movement for Black Lives, is being targeted with the same cyber weapons that she spent her career developing. And she has to like work out what it means to tell a story in which she's a good person when she can still see the blowback, and what she's going to do next to redeem herself. And, you know, I think that that's a much chewier, more interesting, higher stakes story. A story in which winning may involve permanently alienating yourself from people you like and who you want to be on the same side of. But there's no way that both of you can have it your way, and the issue matters so much that neither of you can give on it. That's a really tense, important, great, pulpy story. And it's a story that I'm you know, much more interested in reading these days, not least because it primes us to understand what it is our neighbors are doing when crisis hits and they have a different idea to our ideas about what we should do about it. Because we're in you know, the path of many crises to come, you know, and so we really do need to figure out what our intuition around our neighbors during crises should be. Otherwise, it could go, you know, much worse than even the negative projections that I think keep all of us at night up.
I can't wait to read it. It's really interesting.